Long before cities, before writing, before wheels and metal, humans relied on their hands and on the stones, sticks, and bones they shaped into tools. These were not just objects. They were extensions of thought, careful instruments that allowed early humans to adapt, survive, and experiment with the world around them. Tonight, we journey tens of thousands of years into the past, to the quiet moments when hands became machines. We will observe the careful strikes, the patient shaping, and the slow, deliberate rhythms that transformed ordinary materials into the first technology. Join me as we witness the subtle ingenuity that laid the foundation for human progress, one stone at a time. Imagine the slow dawn of the Pleistocene world, somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago. The air is dry and thin, the grasses coarse and yellow. In the dim light of morning, a small band of early humans, Homo habilis, perhaps moves through the savanna. You can almost hear the rustle of grass beneath their cautious steps. There is no language yet, not really. Just soft grunts, gestures, and the occasional cry that means danger or food. They are not hunters of great beasts yet. They are gatherers and opportunists, scavengers at best. The predators rule the land, saber-toothed cats, hyenas larger than any seen today, and the distant roars of lions. But in this world of survival, the smallest shift, one human helping another, changes everything. A young one stumbles, cutting their foot on a sharp stone. In many animal species, that would mean the end, one less mouth to feed, one weaker member left behind. But here, one of the older females pauses. She does not move on. She waits. She gestures to the others, who slowed down, confused. For the first time, the group hesitates between instinct and compassion. That small pause, that decision not to leave someone behind, is the beginning of something vast. Cooperation. Over time, moments like this accumulate. They do not come from grand speeches or moral insight. They come from necessity, because a group that stays together survives together. An injured member might later be the one to spot danger, to share found food, to help carry a child. Survival becomes communal. Archaeologists find evidence of this quiet cooperation in fossilized bones. One famous discovery, found in the 1960s at the site of Demonacy in Georgia, shows a nearly toothless hominin who lived years after losing the ability to chew. Without help, that would have been impossible. Someone must have chewed food for them, or softened it somehow. Someone cared enough to keep them alive. Imagine that scene, firelight flickering against stone faces, a small circle of warmth in the cold darkness, a half-chewed piece of food being shared with a weak elder. Nothing glorious, no heroics, just slow, shared endurance. That was humanity's first kind of love. As these groups moved through the landscape, cooperation reshaped their lives. The act of watching over one another required patience. Patience required time. Time demanded safety. And safety required planning, something no other creature had done in quite this way before. They began to leave marks, not of art or worship yet, but of routine, stones arranged to weigh down hides against the wind, simple pits dug to store gathered nuts, trails worn smooth by repeated footsteps. Each mark is a quiet echo of shared life. When you think about early humans, it's tempting to imagine excitement hunts, discoveries, firelight stories. But the truth is gentler. Most of their lives were spent waiting for fruit to ripen, for animals to move, for wounds to heal. Their days were long, repetitive, filled with silence and observation. They would have learned the moods of the landscape, how the clouds gathered before rain, how the insects hummed differently in the heat, how predators' eyes reflected faintly under the moon. Over years, this knowledge became shared wisdom, passed not through words, but through mimicry and memory. And so, a quiet rhythm of life developed. Wake, search, share, rest, repeat. Each act was small, almost invisible. Yet together, they formed the first heartbeat of culture. Far to the east, in regions that would one day be Kenya and Ethiopia, the same story unfolded in 100 small ways. Fossil evidence suggests that groups of Homo erectus began dividing tasks, not with spoken plans, but through behavior. Some searched for food, others gathered stones or wood. The group survived not because one was strongest, but because all contributed in their own quiet ways. This cooperation began to alter evolution itself. Those who helped others lived longer. Their offspring learned those same habits. Slowly, generation by generation, the instinct to cooperate became as strong as the instinct to flee. There is a certain stillness in imagining that world. No cities, no fires that burned all night. Just the soft rhythm of footsteps, the crunch of seeds between teeth, the rustle of dry leaves, and the occasional soft hum of comfort from one human to another. It is here, in this long and uneventful age, that humanity truly began. Not in battle or invention, but in boredom, in the small, steady care of ordinary survival. Archaeologists and anthropologists often speak of social brains, the idea that our minds evolved not just to find food or escape danger, but to manage the complex relationships within a group, to remember who shared food, who warned of danger, who helped and who didn't. You can almost picture the scene around a dying fire. A few individuals close together, warmth fading, eyes half closed, memories forming. Perhaps someone hums softly, not music, not yet, but something like it, a rhythm, a comfort, the first lullaby, perhaps long before the first word. Through thousands of years, this simple behavior, helping one another's spread, it became the difference between extinction and endurance. And though we imagine early humans as wild and primitive, there is something profoundly human in their slowness, their quiet attention to one another, their endurance without reward. As the dawn rises over the prehistoric plains, one might wonder, when did helping become love? When did survival turn into society? When did the simple act of waiting for another to heal become the foundation for everything that followed: villages, families, civilization itself? Perhaps that moment, unmarked and unseen, was the most important in all of human history. Evening settles slowly over the ancient grasslands. The light stretches thin across the tall, dry reeds, and shadows grow long. The small group of early humans, perhaps a dozen at most, returns from the day's search for food. Their pace is measured, careful. The smallest ones cling to the sides of adults, their bare feet brushing through the dust. They carry little, a few roots, a handful of berries, and, occasionally, a scrap of meat scavenged from a carcass left by larger predators. But what they carry is not as important as what they do with it. Somewhere near the edge of a shallow ravine, the group settles. The air cools quickly now. One of the older males, his skin thick and scarred from years in the sun, crouches over a pile of stones. He strikes one against another, the sound sharp in the stillness. The others watch with a kind of patient curiosity. The goal is not yet to make fire, not yet, but to shape edges, to create tools that might pry open bone or cut through sinew. These tools mean food, and food means survival. But food is not eaten alone, not anymore. Over time, archaeologists have found that early humans, long before modern language, long before even Homo sapiens developed patterns of food sharing that set them apart from all other species. Bones found at ancient campsites show signs of division. The marrow was split, shared among several individuals. The meat was cut evenly, and in some cases, remains were found at the sleeping areas of both the young and the old. It is one of the quietest revolutions in history, the invention of fairness. The first circles of trust. Imagine this moment. The group huddled in a loose ring. Someone passes a portion of food to another. A gesture, nothing more, but one that carries a meaning larger than hunger. It says, "We survive together." The act of sharing food changes everything. It teaches patience, the understanding that you might give today and receive tomorrow. It teaches restraint, the ability to wait until everyone has their share. It teaches empathy, the ability to imagine another's hunger as your own. And in a world filled with predators, this kind of cooperation becomes a kind of defense. You can picture it. The night deepens, and with it, the calls of lions echo across the plain. The group gathers tighter. There are no walls, no weapons strong enough to guarantee safety. What they have instead is one another's ears listening, eyes watching, hearts alert. Each sound matters. The rustle of grass, the crack of a twig, the low growl carried on the wind. Someone shifts closer to the center. Another wraps an arm around a child. The oldest among them keeps watch. Sleep comes in shifts, brief and uncertain. For countless generations, this is how humanity survived the dark. They did not dominate nature, they endured it patiently. Their strength was not in force, but in connection. The language before words, even without speech, communication thrived. Early humans used gesture, expression, and sound to coordinate. The twitch of an eyebrow could mean stay still. A grunt could mean food there. A soft call could warn of danger. Anthropologists suggest that long before the first spoken languages, humans developed proto-conversation, the ability to anticipate another's needs through shared rhythm and repetition. It might sound uneventful, but this is where empathy takes root. When one member of the group stumbles and another reaches out, it's not because of instinct alone. It's because they've begun to feel each other's state. And so, the long nights of prehistory became classrooms of quiet communication. Each small noise and movement reinforced a pattern and cooperation. Grow into something larger, something resembling society itself. The sun lifts slowly over the ancient landscape. Dew clings to blades of grass, and a faint mist hangs over the low hills. A group of early humans moves together, quiet and deliberate. Their pace is slower than that of the predators that share this world, but it is steadier. They know where they're going, and more importantly, why. Something has changed since the earliest days of wandering and waiting. the same cooperation that once meant sharing food and guarding. Fire has evolved into something new: organization, the birth of a plant somewhere deep in time. Perhaps 400,000 years ago, early humans began to do something no other species had done with such intent. They began to plan together. The evidence lies scattered in caves and ancient riverbeds. Stones carefully shaped into matching sizes. Spears hardened by fire. Bones arranged in patterns suggesting shared butchering and storage. These are not random acts of survival. These are the marks of coordination of a species that has begun to think beyond the moment. Imagine this moment: a small group crouched beneath a low tree, the air tense with anticipation. Across the field, a herd of grazing animals moves lazily. The humans communicate with gestures, silent signals, glances, the twitch of a hand. One moves left, another circles right. A few wait near the water's edge. When the time comes, they rush together, driving the animals toward a narrow passage. Panic erupts. Hooves pound the earth. It's chaotic, yes, but not accidental. When the dust settles, one of the animals lies still. The hunt has worked. It is not just the kill that matters, it's the plan. For the first time, survival has been foreseen. The group has acted not by instinct, but by collective thought. This moment, quiet and unrecorded, is the birth of strategy. The first spark of what would one day become politics, leadership, and society. The leaders who never spoke there were no words for leader or decision. But every group had someone who others followed, perhaps the strongest, or the calmest, or simply the one who noticed danger first. Leadership then was not about power. It was about attentiveness. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies note that early forms of leadership were fluid. Whoever had the best idea for a situation, whether finding food or avoiding predators, took temporary authority. Then it shifted again. That same fluidity likely existed in the earliest human bands. It was not domination, but trust, the kind that grows slowly through repeated acts of reliability. It's almost poetic. Our first leaders were the ones who paid the most attention, and yet, even this kind of leadership changed the rhythm of survival. When someone could anticipate where the herd might move, or when the fruit would ripen, they gave the group something new: time to prepare, time to rest, time to think. That space between reaction and intention is where human culture began. The camps that stayed longer before this point. Early humans were mostly nomadic. They followed the seasons, moving as food sources shifted. But around 300,000 years ago, evidence suggests that some groups began staying longer in certain places. Camps became semi-permanent. Tools were left behind for reuse. Fires were maintained for weeks instead of nights. These camps represent something subtle but monumental: the beginnings of home. Imagine the Sina small clearing protected by rocks, with a central fire pit surrounded by sleeping areas, animal bones and shells scattered nearby, the ground worn smooth where feet have passed over it again and again. At dawn, the group disperses to gather food, leaving a few behind to tend the fire. At dusk, they return to the same circle, their voices still more gesture than speech, carrying softly through the air. The camp becomes a memory, a reference point, an anchor. Even when they move on, they remember where it was. Perhaps they return months later, finding the old stones where they left them. This habit of returning marks a profound shift. The world becomes familiar. The unknown begins to shrink. In that familiarity lies the seed of community, the rhythm of cooperation. By now, the cycle of human life has become almost musical. Gather in the morning, hunt when needed, watch for danger, repair tools, rest, repeat. It sounds dull, perhaps, but this predictability is what allowed culture to grow. Stability gives space for observation, and observation gives birth to creativity. Around shared fires, they begin to make marks on stones, not yet art, but patterns. They shape bones into smoother forms. They start to use color preps from red ochre, rubbing it on tools or even on their own skin. These acts serve no immediate purpose in survival. They are gestures of recognition, an early sense of self, of belonging to a group, and that, too, is a form of cooperation. The creation of identity, facing the night as one. The nights are still long, the predators still circle, but something feels different now. The fear is less sharp, the vigilance more shared. When danger comes, they respond together. Stones are thrown, fire is waved, the circle tightens. Children are moved to the center. Everyone has a role. This cooperation gives birth to courage, not the loud, heroic kind, but the quiet sort that endures. Archaeological traces from places like Boxgrove in England and Schigenin in Germany show that early humans coordinated hunts using wooden spears. These tools required time and skill to make. More importantly, they required trust that the others would stand beside you, not run. Standing together became a habit, and that habit became culture, the invisible thread of memory over generations. These experiences were remembered not in words, but in action. Children learned the paths of migration, the safe places to camp, the timing of rains. Each gesture, each habit was a fragment of history passed forward through repetition. This is the earliest form of tradition you can imagine, an older human showing a child how to find tubers beneath the soil, or how to notice the tracks of a gazelle. There are no lessons, no lectures, only demonstration, patience, and imitation. But through these quiet exchanges, knowledge accumulates. Over time, groups begin to differ slightly from one another, some preferring certain tools, others settling near certain landscapes. These differences are the faint beginnings of culture as we know it. It all began with one generation caring enough to teach the next. From cooperation to compassionate. Is tempting to view these developments as purely practical, sharing food, making fire, hunting together. But beneath those actions lies something even more remarkable: compassion. We see it in fossils, the healed bones of injured individuals who would not have survived alone. We see it in burial sites that show care for the dead, even before religion as we understand it. Compassion is not efficient. It takes time, effort, and risk. Yet it is the most deeply human act of all, in caring for one another. Our ancestors built invisible bonds that were stronger than any tool or weapon. Those bonds would one day sustain villages, nations, and entire civilizations. All of it began with a single act of waiting. The first futures, by the late Paleolithic, humans were not just surviving the present, they were imagining the future. The concept of tomorrow began to shape their lives. they stored food. They made tools in advance. They planned migrations. This sense of continuity, the belief that life tomorrow would still exist, was revolutionary. It allowed hope to enter the human story. It's easy to overlook the power of that idea. But for millions of years before, most life existed only in the moment. To think ahead is to believe in stability. And to believe in stability is to trust others to share it with you. That is how community begins, not with architecture or law, but with shared expectations. The long, quiet legacy of you could stand among them. If you could step back into that age and listen, you would hear almost nothing. A soft crackle of fire, the faint hum of insects, the breathing of sleepers. Yet beneath that quiet lies the foundation of everything we are. Every city skyline, every story, every act of kindness traces back to those nameless ancestors who learned to stay together, to plan, to trust. They did not know they were building history. They only knew that to survive another day, they needed one another. And in that gentle dependence, humanity found its shape. As the sun sets again on that distant world, smoke drifts into the cooling air. The circle of firelight flickers and fades. Somewhere out in the dark, the first whisper of language is forming, sound shaped not just by need, but by recognition. It says something simple, something timeless. We are here together. From the silence of the savannah to the rhythm of community, we've traced how early cooperation slowly became the first form of culture. The quiet invention of the hearth will explore how fire, once a fragile, borrowed gift from the sky, became the heart of every human gathering, changing the way our ancestors lived, ate, and thought. Night falls on a time so ancient that the stars above shine down on landscapes no one has ever named. A small band of early humans, perhaps Homo erectus, moves carefully through the cooling air. Their day has been long, gathering roots, cracking nuts, watching the movements of other animals. Now the wind grows cold, and their pace quickens toward the faint orange glow flickering in the distance. It is not their fire, not yet. The flame belongs to the sky, born from a storm that passed the previous night. Lightning struck a dead tree, splitting it open and setting the grass ablaze. For hours it burned, the heat fierce, the smoke thick. Now only glowing embers remain, hidden in the charred trunk. The group approaches slowly, wary. Even now, fire is both wonder and danger. The air shimmers with heat, the ground blackened beneath their feet. They have seen such things before, the sudden brightness that devours trees and animals alike. But they have learned something new after the storm. If one is careful, one can take what remains. One of them picks up a smoldering branch, shaking it to test its heat. The ember glows faintly red. Another finds a hollow piece of bark and places the branch inside. Together they move away from the ruins of the tree, carrying the trembling light with them. It is the first act of keeping fire, borrowed, not made. Long before humans discovered how to make fire, they learned how to keep it alive. Evidence from sites like Kubi Fora in Kenya and Chesawanya shows traces of charred earth, nearly 1.5 million years old, ashes carefully contained, not random, suggesting the presence of watchful hands. Fire was borrowed from nature. It had to be found after lightning, volcanic eruptions, or wildfires, then protected, day and night. Someone had to tend it, to feed it with dry grass, to shield it from the wind. And so, for the first time in human history, a new kind of duty was born. Guardianship. To keep a fire alive meant keeping the group alive. It provided warmth through cold nights, kept predators at bay, and offered safety that no other animal knew. The fire became more than a tool, it became a presence, something both feared and revered. The circle of light. The group settles in a shallow cave near a river. The embers are placed in the center, on a bed of dry leaves. Someone blows, gently feeding it small twigs. The flame trembles, then catches, flaring upward with a sudden rush of light. Drawn by the warmth, you can almost hear it, the soft crackle, the faint hum of breathing, the sigh of relief. Around the fire, they sit in a loose circle. Shadows dance across the rough stone walls. The flickering light changes everything. It pushes back the dark, turns night into something almost safe. That circle becomes the first home. Within it, new behaviors take root. People sit closer together. They share food near the warmth. They rest more deeply, no longer waking in constant fear of predators. The young play with sticks and ashes. The old rest their bones by the glow. This small, repetitive comfort reshapes the rhythm of human life. The night, once only danger, becomes time for reflection, for quiet, for connection. Cooking the world. At some point, perhaps by accident, someone drops a piece of food too close to the flames. A root, a bit of meat, a handful of seeds. The smell that rises is strange, sweet, rich, and entirely new. Tentative hands retrieve it. The texture is different, softer, warmer, easier to chew. The taste, unfamiliar, but good. That small discovery, repeated countless times, transforms not just diet, but biology. Cooked food provides more energy, requires less chewing, and allows the body to absorb nutrients more efficiently. Over generations, jaws grow smaller, brains larger, all because of a mistake by the fire. The hearth becomes a quiet laboratory of evolution. Each night, humans experiment without realizing it, drying seeds, softening roots, warming bones to crack the marrow more easily. They are not inventors in the way we think of invention. They are observers, repeating what works through these slow, accidental lessons. The hearth becomes humanity's first technology of transformation. The firekeepers vigil, but with fire comes responsibility. Every group soon learns the same hard truth. A flame left untended dies, and without it, cold and darkness return. So someone must always keep watch. Perhaps the old, who no longer travel far. Perhaps a mother nursing a child. Perhaps a young one too restless to sleep. Through the long hours of the night, one person stays near the embers, feeding them wood, whispering softly, keeping them alive. In that act of vigilance, something profound occurs. Time becomes shared. For the first time, humans divide the night into roles: sleepers and watchers, those who rest and those who guard. This division introduces the idea of continuity, the assurance that even when one sleeps, another wakes. It is a form of trust so simple we almost miss its power. The hearth is not just a tool for warmth. It is the first clock, the first schedule, the first ritual, the fire's memory. Over time, ashes accumulate. The ground near the hearth darkens, layered with soot and fragments of bone. Archaeologists today uncover these blackened rings in caves and ancient shelter circles that mark not chaos, but constancy. Every layer of ash tells a story of meals eaten, of nights endured, of generations returning to the same spot. Some sites show hearths rebuilt in the same place for hundreds of years. Imagine that children growing up beside the same patch of ground where their grandparents once warmed their hands. The fire becomes a link through time, and perhaps, in those long nights, when conversation did not yet exist, humans began to feel something new, belonging, not just to a group, but to a place. The fire and the skyther hearth also changed how humans looked upward. Before fire, the night sky was immense and cold, a field of distant light, unreachable and unchanging. But with fire, a reflection was born, a small sun on the ground. The stars above and the flames below mirrored one another. Both flickered, both offered warmth in their own way. It's not difficult to imagine how reverence began, not worship yet, but a quiet dog. Perhaps they began to gesture toward the stars while tending the fire, wondering if the light up there was like the one here. If fire connected heaven and earth, it also connected past and future. For as long as the flame burned, the group survived. If it went out, their link to safety and, perhaps, to the divine was broken. The hearth became not only practical, but sacred. The invisible shift as centuries turned into millennia. Fire reshaped the human mind. It slowed life down before. Darkness forced movement, either to flee, to hide, or to endure. Now, with light and warmth, people could stay still. They could think, rest, remember. That stillness gave birth to imagination. Somewhere in the quiet glow, eyes half closed, someone began to picture things, not seen memories, dreams, fears, hopes. Perhaps they began to hum softly or trace patterns in the ash. The first stories may have been told here, in gestures and murmurs. Long before words existed, the hearth is the first stage, the birthplace of culture, of storytelling, of thought itself. The slow dawn of civilization. With the hearth came routine, and with routine came structure. Each morning, the fire's ashes were stirred, the coals reawakened. Each night, the wood was gathered again. The cycle never ended. It may seem repetitive, even dull, but in that repetition lies the seed of civilization. Keeping a fire demands memory, patience, and cooperation. It turns chaos into order, and order into comfort. This quiet consistency changes everything. Wherever humans travel, they carry this ritual with them across continents, across ages. Even today, every kitchen, every campfire, every lamp in the dark is an echo of that ancient circle. The hearth has followed us into the present, its warmth unchanged, so as the flames crackle softly in that long-ago night. You can almost hear the rhythm of the future forming, the sharing of food, the watching of embers, the passing of time from one keeper to another. The hearth is more than survival, it is the first gathering place of humanity. But how did this fragile light, born of borrowed embers and storm fire, become a permanent companion? How did early humans finally learn to create it themselves, summoning flame from stone, spark, and patience? Night again, but not the same night as before. This one has walls, stone walls, or perhaps packed earth, uneven low, but shelter nonetheless. A shallow pit lies in the center, lined with ash and half-burned sticks. Around it are the traces of a life no longer entirely at the mercy of nature. Bones cracked from marrow, stones blackened from repeated use, a few shards of flint glinting faintly in the firelight. This is the hearth, not just a fire, but a place for fire. And with its arrival, humanity begins to discover home, from temporary to permanent for hundreds of thousands of years. Fire had been a companion of movement, carried carefully from one camp to another, rekindled beneath open skies. But once humans began to return to the same places season after season, caves, riverbanks, sheltered valleys, fire began to stay put. Archaeologists can trace this shift in layers of ash. In early sites like Qasim Cave in Israel or Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, there are deep, distinct deposits, charcoal, burnt bones, soot clinging to ceilings. These were not one-time fires. They were long-lived, tended day after day. It marks one of the first quiet revolutions of human existence, the beginning of settlement, not farming yet, not cities, just the idea that one could stay, that the world might offer a place to return to. The hearth became the anchor, the hearth, as memory when a group left a shelter behind. They often left the hearth intact, a shallow circle of stones, perhaps, or a bed of cooled ash. When they returned months later, they would find it waiting, a simple pile of stones, a memory of warmth. And so the first human architecture began, not with walls, but with a hole in the ground for fire. Every hearth was a marker of belonging, of time, of identity. You could imagine someone saying, if they had words, "Here, this was ours." Even when new families came, they built their fires in the same place, rekindling warmth from ancient ashes. One flame passed to another. One generation's glow became the next's. Fire gave people not only heat, but continuity, light that binds in the long evenings. People gathered close to the hearth. The world beyond its glow was vast and full of teeth. But here, within this circle, there was safety. It's easy to underestimate what that meant. To stay close to the hearth meant belonging. Those outside its light were strangers, wanderers, or threats. The hearth drew invisible lines between us and them, between the known and the wild. That simple division shaped the whole of human society. Every later notion of home, village, or nation begins with this: a fire at the center. People gathered around it, warmth inside, darkness outside. The world's first borders were made of light. The birth of routine fire encouraged repetition, and repetition became culture. Each evening, someone had to gather fuel. Someone had to watch the flames, stir the embers, keep them alive until dawn. Each morning, the ashes had to be cleared, the stones adjusted, the coals rekindled. Over time, these tasks became habits. Habits became traditions. A hearth wasn't just a place to cook or warm yourself. It was the center of daily rhythm. The word hearth itself would one day share roots with heart, and it's easy to see why. The steady glow of fire mirrored the steady beat of life. It gave a pulse to the home, a focus around which time itself seemed to flow. Food, patience, and the art of waiting with the hearth. Came the possibility of slow cooking in earlier ages. Food was eaten raw or quickly roasted. But now, with a steady flame available, people learned to simmer roots, to roast meat slowly over embers, to dry herbs and smoke fish for the coming weeks. Cooking was not simply about flavor. It was about time. It required waiting, watching, knowing the signs, the crackle that meant wood to dry, the hiss of fat falling into flame, the scent that told you a meal was done in that waiting. Humanity discovered something new, patience. And patience, in turn, made room for reflection. The slow art of tending fire paralleled the slow art of thought. It's possible that in these long pauses by the hearth, our ancestors first began to think about time, not just as the rising and setting of the sun, but as something that stretched past and future, memory and plan. Stories by Fire Litas. It also became the stage of the imagination. By the flickering light, shadows danced against cave walls. Flickers might become the shapes of animals, spirits, ancestors. Someone would hum or gesture or point. A story would form first as motion, then as sound. The hearth gave us not only light, but language. The warmth kept people still long enough to speak, to listen, to remember. And so, every night around the fire was also a lesson of what to fear, of what to cherish, of who we were. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, we still gather around glowing screens, repeating the same instinct to share warmth, to share story, to keep the dark at bay. The hearth and the family in every human settlement since. The hearth has remained the symbol of the household, the mother's place, the family's center. Archaeologists studying Neolithic homes often find that the hearth is always central, often aligned with the door. It is placed where smoke can escape, but warmth can stay. Food, birth, mourning, celebration, all revolved around it. Children learned by watching their elders tend the fire, just as those elders had watched theirs. It was the continuity of fire, passed hand to hand. And when a person died, sometimes a piece of glowing coal from their hearth would be carried to the new one, a spark of their life continuing on in that sense. The hearth was not only physical, it was spiritual. It represented both the endurance of warmth and the endurance of memory. From hearth to home, as humans began to build more permanent dwellings, the hearth dictated the design. Circular huts were arranged around a central flame. Later, rectangular homes still placed the fireplace at the core. Whole villages formed with communal hearths, open squares where everyone shared warmth and food. Even as architecture evolved, from mud huts to stone houses, the pattern persisted, fire at the center, walls around the flame. It is the oldest form of architecture still alive in our homes today. Every kitchen stove, every fireplace, every campfire in a clearing, they are direct descendants of those first circles of warmth. The meaning of warmth, it's easy, in our world of electric lights and central heating, to forget what fire truly meant. For early humans, warmth was life. A single night without it could mean death. To tend the hearth was an act of love, of duty. It was the quiet work that ensured tomorrow. Perhaps that is why every culture, from the Inuit to the Greeks, treated the hearth as sacred. It wasn't merely a convenience. It was the place where the human and the divine met through care. The fire gave freely, but only to those who respected it. The hearth, as civilizations, seed the Domestication of fire laid the foundation for everything that came next. With stable warmth, humans could survive harsh climates. With cooked food, they absorbed more energy with less effort, feeding the growing brain. With light, they could extend their day's plan and create. The hearth turned survival into society. Villages grew from the steady rhythm of shared fires. Agriculture, pottery, even religion, all took root in that circle of warmth and patience. From a biological standpoint, fire changed us physically. Our jaws grew smaller, our digestion more efficient, our sleep cycles adapted to evening light. We became not only thinkers, but planners, not only survivors, but builders. Echoes in modern life even today. Though we rarely notice it, our language remembers the hearth's power. We speak of keeping the home fires burning, of hearth and home, of someone having a warm heart. When we gather for holidays, or sit near a candle, or cook a meal for family, we are performing echoes of rituals that began nearly 500,000 years ago. The warmth we seek is not merely physical, it is ancestral. Some part of us still remembers that the world was once cold and dark, and that the only safety we ever truly knew was found in the circle of firelight. Surrounded by familiar faces, the flame that never died. You could trace all human history back through time, past empires and inventions. Through wars and migrations, you would find, at its root, one continuous flame, the same fire that burned in a Pleistocene cave, sheltered by rough hands, is the same that burns now in the stoves and lamps of every home. Each time you light a candle or strike a match, you are rekindling a lineage, millions of years old, the same spark that once flickered against stone walls and reflected in the eyes of those who first learned to make the world warm. It is humbling to think that civilization itself began with something so small, so ordinary, and so boring, a few stones, a nest of dry grass, a hand cupping flame against the wind. But that's where humanity began, not in conquest, but in comfort, not in glory, but in warmth. The last embers of the prehistoric hearth fade to a soft red. Outside, the wind moves gently through the dark grasslands. Inside, the glow lingers, a memory that will never truly go out. Fire, the first home, the first teacher, the first light, the heart of every human story ever told. You can imagine the sound, first, not of beasts or footsteps, but of the wind, a deep, low moan rolling across a barren landscape. Grass lies flat beneath it, dust rising in faint spirals. The world is colder now, the ice age creeping closer year by year, so slowly that no one living would notice, and yet the seasons are not what they used to be. Early humans, still nomadic, begin to notice the change. Nights stretch longer, food grows scarcer, and the once familiar trees thin into tundra. The great herds of mammoth and bison move differently now, seeking shelter. The wind is constant. Somewhere in this wide and empty plain, a small group of humans has gathered near a fallen tree. They crouch close together, hides pulled tight against their bodies. The fire crackles weakly, its flame bending away from the gusts. It is not enough. They cannot keep living like this, open to the cold, the wind, the endless sky. They need a way to hide from the world itself. The birth of shelter before there were houses. There were windbreaks, simple barriers of branches and grass, arranged to block the prevailing gusts. At first, they were little more than accidents, a cluster of rocks, a hollow in a hillside, a fallen tree that happened to shield the fire. But soon, pattern became intention. The same hands that had learned to stack stones around the hearth now began to build upward. Sticks were leaned together, tied with vine, covered in grass or skins. In a few hours of quiet work, the open plain could become something new, a place where the wind could not reach. Archaeologists have found traces of these earliest shelters, circles of mammoth bones in Ukraine and Russia, dated as far back as 20,000 years ago. Others, in France and the Czech Republic, show pits dug into the ground, with stone foundations and coverings of hide or turf. These were not permanent homes yet, but decisions. Each one said, "We will stay a little longer." The landscape as teacher. To build a shelter, you had to understand the land, where the wind came from, how the rain pooled, where the morning sun would warm the ground. Humans learned to read the earth. They noticed that in the shadow of a rock, snow melted slower, that near a cluster of trees, frost formed differently, that animal burrows stayed warm even in the dead of winter. They began to copy what they saw: the curvature of a den, the layering of leaves, the shape of a bird's nest. Nature became the first architect, and humanity its patient apprentice. Every structure they built was quiet, small, and humble, not monuments, but shelters of necessity. Yet each was a profound statement that the world could be shaped. That exposure was no longer destiny. Inside the first walls, imagine stepping into one of these early shelters. The entrance is low. You must stoop or crawl. Inside, the air is still, heavy with the smell of smoke and hides. The sound of the wind outside is muted now, distant. A small fire flickers in the center, its light painting orange shapes across the curved interior. Around it lie simple objects, stones blackened by use, cracked bones, a pile of dried grass. For sleeping, it is dark, cramped, and ordinary, and yet, for the first time, it feels like a room. The boundary between inside and outside has been drawn. Here, warmth stays. Here, voices echo differently. Here, one can rest. The invention of rest before shelter. Rest was shallow and brief, a few hours at a time, ears always alert, body curled tight against the cold. But now, with protection from the elements, sleep could stretch longer, deeper. It may seem like a small thing, but the ability to rest fully changed everything. Better rest meant clearer thought, sharper memory, more patience. A well-sheltered body could endure hunger longer, heal faster, and in the stillness of those protected nights, another transformation began. Dreaming, not just the brief flashes of the animal mind, but the long, vivid dreams that come with deep sleep. In them, humans may have replayed the day's events, practiced new ideas, imagined possibilities. The first architects dreamed before they built. Materials of necessity. The early shelters varied wildly depending on where people lived. In open plains, mammoth bones, large sticks, hides stretched over frames. In forested regions, branches, leaves, bark, and mud. In coastal areas, driftwood, shells, and seaweed insulation. In colder climates, snow itself, packed into rounded walls, the ancestors of igloos. Nothing was wasted. Everything was tried. A simple innovation, placing heated stones near the edges of the shelter to radiate warmth, may have saved countless lives. Later, pits were dug partially into the earth to trap heat. The ground became both wall and floor, turning landscape into structure. Each shelter was both invention and experiment, shaped by necessity, guided by patience. The social space, the moment humans built walls, even primitive ones, social life changed. A hearth inside a shelter meant that family or tribe gathered in closer proximity. The flickering light illuminated faces, gestures, subtle expressions. Communication became more complex. Children learned by watching, not from a distance, but at their parents' sides. Here, within walls, humans discovered intimacy. It's no coincidence that the earliest art cave paintings appeared soon after the habit of sheltering indoors spread. Protected spaces allowed time and stillness enough to create. What began as protection became reflection. The weather as opponent as the Ice Age deepened. Weather dictated everything. A sudden storm or a failed shelter could mean death within hours, so every detail mattered. How to tie skins so they would not tear in the wind. How to place stones to stop the rain from pooling. How to seal gaps with mud or moss. Every small act was a quiet defiance of nature, not through strength, but through care. For the first time, humans were not merely surviving in the world, but against it, gently, intelligently, persistently. This was not conquest. It was coexistence through adaptation. The slow invention of home and time, these shelters became more than temporary stops. Some groups began to repair them when they returned each season. Eventually, they stayed longer and longer until movement itself became less frequent. These early semi-permanent camps were the first seeds of community, and in every one of them, at the center, there was always fire. Fire and shelter together, the two inventions that made humanity stationary, thoughtful, capable of imagining tomorrow. The combination gave rise to something entirely new, domestic life, no longer just hunters or wanderers. These humans began to tend, to maintain, to plan, a small miracle of quiet. It's easy to overlook the miracle in this stillness. A group of early humans, silent inside a low shelter, listening to the wind outside. The walls creak slightly. Sparks drift upward through a small opening in the roof. No words are spoken. Perhaps there are no true words yet, but the silence is shared. They are warm. They are dry. They are together. The world beyond may be wild and cold, but for the first time, there is a barrier, a human-made space where survival feels steady, even peaceful. The first door anthropologists suggest that the idea of a door, a deliberate entrance and exit, was a monumental step in cognitive evolution. To make a doorway was to understand privacy, ownership, inside and outside. A flap of hide over an opening, a stone rolled across an entrance, even a symbolic marker. Each represented the same thought. This is ours. We made this. The act of stepping inside became ritual. The act of closing the entrance became safety. Shelter gave humans not just protection from the world, but a sense of place within it. End of section. Reflection. The Ice Age would continue for many millennia, sculpting glaciers, shaping rivers, changing migration paths. But by the time it passed, Humans would never again live entirely in the open. The wind could roar, the rain could fall, but somewhere there would always be a circle of stones, a roof of branches, a flickering fire, and the memory of the first night the world stayed outside. The invention of shelter didn't make life exciting, it made it bearable, which for our ancestors was the greatest form of progress imaginable. It is in this quiet, unremarkable act of hiding from the sky that civilization found its beginning. When you picture the world of early humans, imagine not just hunters and wanderers, but builders, not of grand palaces or temples, but of necessity, of survival. The earth itself became both material and teacher. Every stone, every fallen branch, every scrap of hide offered a clue, and from those clues, humans began to design. This section is about that slow awakening, the shift from hiding in nature's shadows to shaping them. The first walls were made not of ambition, but of patience, learning to shape the world in the frozen plains of Eastern Europe. Some 20,000 years ago, long before the pyramids or even pottery, groups of Ice Age people began to build structures using the bones of mammoths. At first glance, it seems almost absurd, an entire hut built from skulls, tusks, and ribs. But look closer, and it becomes clear. This was engineering born from scarcity and observation. Wood was rare on the cold steppe, so they turned to what the land offered, the remains of giants. Ribs became arches, jaws became supports. Hides were stretched over frames of bone to block the wind. Entrances faced away from prevailing gusts. These were not random piles of remains, they were plans, and those plans mark the first known architecture in human history. The mammoth bone houses have uncovered nearly 24 of these bone dwellings across modern Ukraine, Russia, and the Czech Republic. Some are small, perhaps a few meters wide. Others are larger, with hearths and work areas inside. The floors show evidence of careful preparation, ash spread to keep moisture out, stones arranged around fire pits, and tools deliberately placed. There's a rhythm to the design. Circular foundations of bones set in shallow trenches, entrances oriented southeast to catch morning light, fire pits placed slightly off-center to prevent smoke buildup, perimeter areas used for sleeping and storage. Each of these details might seem trivial, but together they show something profound. Humans were learning to think spatially, systematically. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building environments. The builders. Logic consider how they must have reasoned. If one wall blocks the wind, 2 walls will block it better. If a fire keeps us warm, then a roof will keep the heat inside. If one shelter lasts a season, then one built with care might last a year. Through endless cycles of trial and error, they developed rules of construction long before any written word. These unwritten codes passed through generations. How to tie sinew for strength, how to choose dry branches that wouldn't warp, how to layer materials to resist rain. Their craft was invisible but revolutionary, the first form of applied knowledge. What we now call engineering by memory. The builder's tools, the tools of this new craft, were simple. Stone scrapers for shaping hides, flint blades for cutting bone, hammerstones for driving stakes, antler picks for digging shallow pits. But perhaps the most important tool was the hand itself. Human fingers learned to measure instinctively the width of a rib, the thickness of a branch, the distance between supports. Each shelter was hand-measured, hand-shaped, and hand-repaired. It wasn't fast, it wasn't elegant, but it worked. And when the wind came howling across the plains, when the snow fell thick and relentless, those who built stayed alive. The social craft of building was never solitary. It demanded coordination, a level of cooperation that deepened social bonds. Imagine a group of 10, maybe 12 individuals, some gathering materials, others binding them, one tending the fire. A leader, perhaps not by title, but by habit, instructs where to place the next bone, how to angle the roof. They speak little, but gestures and habits fill the silence. The structure rises, not from command, but from shared need. In this cooperation lay the roots of something much larger, the idea that collective effort could create permanence, and permanence, once tasted, becomes impossible to forget. Seasonal builders, not every group built such elaborate dwellings. Some were travelers, following herds, moving with the thaw and freeze. For them, shelters needed to be lighter, faster, temporary. A frame of wood, draped with hides. A pit dug shallow for warmth. A circle of stones to anchor the edges. These could be raised in a few hours, abandoned within days, and rebuilt somewhere new. But even these temporary homes carried design choices, entrances always facing away from the wind, sleeping areas aligned with the fire for maximum warmth, roofs sloped just enough for water to run off. Each detail was learned through repetition, not theory. In a world without blueprints, memory was the only architect. Earth, water, and clay. As humans began to move into milder regions, they found a new material, earth itself, in river valleys. Where soil was soft and malleable, they began to dig. Some built shallow pits to sleep in, covering them with roofs of branches and grass. Others mixed mud with straw, shaping it into clumps that hardened in the sun. These were the earliest forms of wattle and daub, the ancestor of brick and plaster. It's almost poetic. The same ground they had walked on for generations now rose up to protect them. Mud walls may sound dull, but they represent a huge shift. Humans were no longer adapting only to the landscape, they were transforming it. The first permanent villages. Somewhere in this gradual evolution, a quiet miracle occurred. Humans began to return to the same place, year after year, because the shelters were still standing. They began to repair, expand, and improve them. Over time, several shelters clustered together became the first settlements. They weren't yet towns or farms, but they were the seeds of both in the Near East. At sites like Ohalo II and later Jericho, people began to live semi-permanently. The shelters there, circular and organized, show early evidence of planning, layout, spacing, even shared storage areas. Human life, once scattered, began to form patterns. The idea of home was spreading. When builders began to think in lines, there's something subtle but astonishing that happened when humans started building regularly. They began to imagine straight lines. Nature rarely offers them. Trees bend, rivers curve, bones arc. But human shelters started to impose structure where chaos once ruled. To make a wall, you must think of alignment. To make a roof, you must think of symmetry. These thoughts Basic geometry, balance, proportion, all began here in huts of hide and bone, without realizing it. Early builders were shaping not just homes, but the human mind's capacity for order. The quiet pride of builders. It's hard to measure emotion across tens of thousands of years, but one can imagine the quiet pride a family might have felt when their shelter withstood a storm, a wall that didn't collapse, a fire that stayed lit, a child who slept through the night without shivering. These were victories worth remembering, and so the craft of building passed down from generation to generation across continents and climates. Techniques evolved, but the instinct remained to make something that lasts, if only for a little while longer. The first repairs every builder learns from failure. A shelter that leaks teaches where to patch. A wall that collapses shows where to brace. The earliest evidence of repair: layers of mud reapplied, stakes replaced, roofs thickened, shows a new kind of intelligence. Long-term thinking. To fix something meant to believe in the future, to assume you'd still be there to use it again. And with that thought, the concept of continuity entered human life. The shelter wasn't just protection anymore. It was investment. Architecture of patience. When we think of architecture today, we imagine monuments, cathedrals, towers, bridges. But the true foundation of architecture lies here, in the small, repetitive acts of survival: tying knots, smoothing mud, arranging bones. Each motion was quiet, deliberate, patient. Each shelter was a conversation with the landscape, and each improvement a whispered thank you to those who had built before. No one carved their names into these walls. No one called themselves an architect, but through their steady persistence, they invented the most transformative concept in history: the human-made environment. End of section. Reflection. The first shelters were born of fear and cold. But by the time humans learned to build with precision, bone, wood, and earth woven into form, something had changed. They were no longer simply hiding from the world. They were reshaping it. The builders of the Ice Age could not have known it, but in their simple huts and bone circles lay the beginnings of every home, every city, every structure to come. Still, one question remains: as they built stronger shelters and learned to stay longer in one place, what happened to the wanderer's heart? Did stability come at a cost? A quiet restlessness beneath the new roofs of bone and hide? The story of shelter doesn't end with walls and roofs. In truth, that's where the story of us begins. Because once humans learned to stay, once the wind and rain were kept outside, everything else started to change. The invention of shelter was not just about protection. It was about time. Time to think, to plan, to grow old, to raise children in the same place they were born. Time for stories, rituals, and the long, quiet habits that would shape human civilization. In this section, we will sit beside those settled fires and see how the act of staying, the simple decision not to move, transformed what it meant to be human. The first communities. Imagine a small clearing near a river. A cluster of circular huts stands close together, maybe a dozen, maybe more. Each one has a hearth, and the smoke rises through small holes in the roof, forming a thin gray mist above the camp. Children run between the shelters. Women sit by the fires, scraping hides or cracking nuts. Men return carrying fish or bundles of reeds. There are voices now, low, steady conversations that continue from day to day. For the first time, the same people wake up in the same place. It is a small miracle, but it changes everything. When people stay in one place, memory takes root. They begin to remember where things are kept, when certain fruits ripen, which stones by the river make the best tools. And when memory becomes collective, when knowledge is shared rather than lost, society begins. The hearth as center. Every shelter had one constant feature, the fire pit. It was both tool and symbol, warmth, light, and life, all contained within a circle of stones. For nomads, the fire had been temporary, a flicker against the darkness. But now it became permanent. Some ancient hearths show evidence of continuous burning for decades, even centuries. Fires that were never allowed to go out, kept alive through storm, migration, and birth in many cultures that came later. This idea persisted, the eternal flame, the sacred fire, the home's heart. But for these early humans, it wasn't a metaphor. It was survival. As long as the fire burned, the home endured. The hearth became the first boundary of identity, the quiet line between us and the wild beyond food, storage, and the first surplus. When humans stopped moving constantly, their relationship with food began to shift. Before, every meal was a question, what can we find today? Now, inside their shelters, people began to think, what can we keep? The earliest storage pits appear around this time, shallow holes lined with bark, clay, or hide. Grains, roots, dried fish, and nuts were stored inside, hidden from animals and insects. This may seem dull, but it's one of the most important innovations in history, because storage meant choice. It meant the ability to plan beyond the next day, and with that came a strange new feeling, security. For the first time, hunger wasn't inevitable. It could be prevented, managed, predicted. The simple act of placing food in a pit beneath a shelter was the beginning of human economics, the quiet arithmetic of survival. Walls. As memory each generation repaired and expanded the shelters left by the one before. In the earth, traces of these layers can still be seen, the remains of walls rebuilt upon walls, floors replaced, fire pits refilled with ash. Every layer is a record of hands that refuse to leave. It is, in its own way, the first form of history, memory written not in words, but in soil. A shelter that endures through seasons becomes more than structure. It becomes story. And so, the first homes became the first monuments, not to power, but to persistence. The change in the mind, when people began to stay still, their minds did too. The constant alertness of the wanderer softened into routine. Observation turned inward. They began to notice things, not just because they were useful, but because they were there. The curve of a shell, the shape of a leaf, the rhythm of rain on a roof. From these quiet observations, art was born. The same hands that once stacked bones and tied hides began to carve shapes, trace lines, mark walls. In caves and shelters across the world, from Lascaux to Sulawesi, humans painted what they saw, not out of boredom, but because they finally had the time to remember. Art, like shelter, was a way to make the world stay still for a moment longer. The first settled conflicts. Staying put had its price. Wherever permanence grows, so does ownership. A shelter once shared by many could suddenly become someone's. This is ours. This is where we sleep. This is where our fire burns. The first territorial instincts likely began here. Around simple shelters, what was once communal became bounded. What was once movement became place. Archaeological sites show signs of fences and boundaries, appearing not long after permanent shelters. Disputes over water, hunting grounds, or resources may have been the first small sparks of what would later become organized conflict. The act of building had given humans security, but it had also given them something to lose: domestic life and the birth of routine inside these early shelters. Something new emerged: daily rhythm, waking at dawn, tending the fire, repairing tools, preparing food, sleeping beneath the same roof night after night. But it had to begin somewhere, and in that repetition, the endless cycle of maintaining and mending, humans found a strange kind of peace. The world beyond was unpredictable. The storms still came, the herds still moved, the winters still froze, but inside the shelter, life followed a pattern, predictable, familiar, comforting. This was the dawn of what we might call the human routine, the quiet pulse of civilization, the shelter as symbol of our time. Shelters became more than physical protection. They became symbols of identity. To be human was no longer defined by what one hunted or gathered, but by where one lived. Even in language, the shift is visible. Words for house, home, and family often share roots across ancient tongues, each meaning not just a place, but a belonging. A home was no longer simply a structure. It was the center of life, of story, of self, and from this idea that humans could claim a corner of the world and make it their own, came everything else: farming, trade, settlement, civilization, all from a handful of sticks, some bones, and a circle of firelight against the wind. The beginning of rest. There is something deeply human in the desire to rest without fear, to close one's eyes knowing the roof won't collapse, that the fire will stay lit, that others are near. This may have been the most profound gift of all, because in those hours of safety and silence, something remarkable happened. The human mind expanded, dreams grew longer, ideas grew clearer, plans extended beyond the next sunrise. Shelter allowed imagination to stretch, to picture futures, to rehearse inventions, to imagine stories. Every civilization that followed was, in some sense, dreamed beneath a roof of hide and wood. While the wind passed harmlessly outside, a new relationship with the earth. By staying still, humans began to see the world differently. The land was no longer an endless expanse to cross. It became a map of familiar places: the hill beyond the shelter, the bend in the river, the grove that always blossomed first. Attachment took root. The earth was no longer just background, it was home ground. That emotional connection to place, to soil, to belonging, is what would one day lead to agriculture, temples, towns, nations. But in the beginning, it was just this: a small group of people sitting together, watching the same sunrise, knowing they would see it again tomorrow. The legacy of staying every human home since then, every hut, cottage, castle, apartment, carries a trace of those first shelters. The instinct to make a space one's own, to mark, to warm the inside, to keep out the wind. Even now, thousands of generations later, We build for the same reasons: comfort, safety, belonging. We close our doors at night, light our lamps, and listen to the quiet. The same quiet our ancestors must have heard, the soft breathing of others, the crackle of a fire, the wind outside whispering over the earth. End of story. Reflection. The first shelters didn't just keep people alive, they changed how life felt. They turned chaos into rhythm, wandering into memory, survival into society. And yet, perhaps, somewhere deep in that ancient quiet, as the fire burned low and the walls held steady, someone still looked toward the horizon and wondered what lay beyond. Because even as humans learned to stay, to build, to belong, a part of them always remembered the open sky. The story of shelter, then, is not only about staying safe. It's about the balance between safety and curiosity, between the warmth of the fire and the pull of the unknown. And that tension between home and horizon has never really left us. The cold arrived quietly at first. A longer winter here, a later thaw there. Then it deepened, year after year, until the world itself seemed to shiver. Grasslands turned to frost. Rivers froze earlier. The air thinned and bit at bare skin like unseen teeth. And somewhere in this new, unkind world, early humans learned a simple truth. Skin alone was no longer enough. The story of clothing doesn't begin with fashion or beauty. It begins with pain, with wind against flesh, with nights too long and too cold, with survival measured in layers. This is the quiet history of how humans began to wrap themselves, not for vanity, but for endurance. Naked, in a freezing world, our earliest ancestors, Homo erectus, and later, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, all began in climates where warmth came from within, not from what one wore for millions of years. The human body evolved to handle heat, not cold. Bare skin helped release warmth, an adaptation for the African savanna. But as humans wandered north into Europe, Asia, and beyond, they met the cold not as a season, but as a way of life. The Ice Age did not care for invention. It offered no mercy, and so, out of necessity, humanity began its slow and humble art of covering. The first cloaks, skins, and further first clothing wasn't sewn, or even shaped. It was wrapped. A hunter kills an animal, a deer, a mammoth, perhaps even a bear. The meat feeds the group, but then comes a question: what to do with the rest? The hide, once stripped from the carcass, is thick and warm. If dried, it becomes stiff, but if softened by pounding, scraping, and rubbing with animal fat, it becomes pliable. The discovery likely happened by accident, a hunter draping a fresh skin over his shoulders for warmth, only to find it kept him alive through the night. In that moment, something remarkable occurred. The dead began to protect the living. Learning the craft of warmth-making hides wearable took patience. It was not glamorous work. First, the skin had to be scraped clean of fat and tissue using a sharp flint or a piece of bone. Then, it was stretched on the ground or over a frame to dry. Early humans discovered that rubbing the skin with animal brains, rich in natural oils, made it soft and flexible. Later, smoke from fires was used to cure hides, preventing rot and adding waterproofing. Each step was quiet, repetitive, and methodical, the rhythm of survival. And when the work was done, they had something new in the world, a second skin, from hides to tools. The earliest evidence of clothing tools dates back over 100,000 years. In South Africa's Border Cave, archaeologists found all small, pointed tools made from bone, used to pierce leather. In Siberia, at Denisova Cave, ancient needles with carefully carved eyes suggest an even greater sophistication. Imagine the patience required, carving a sliver of bone fine enough to thread sinew through, using only stone tools. It would have taken hours, maybe days, for a single usable needle, but that needle meant survival. With it, humans could bind hides together, fit them to the body, and create garments that moved with them instead of dragging on the ground. A simple bone needle may have saved more lives than any weapon. The clothing of cooperation to make clothing. One needed help. A single hide could be heavy and awkward to prepare. Scraping, stretching, sewing, all required time and many hands. It's likely that for the first time, humans divided labor, not just by age or strength, but by skill. Some hunted, others tanned hides, others stitched. Clothing brought people together, literally and socially. Around shared fires, they softened hides, passed tools, and shared knowledge. What once had been a solitary fight against cold became a collective art, and in those quiet hours of work, something else began to form conversation. The rhythm of scraping and sewing matched the rhythm of speech. Language itself may have found its early practice in the long, slow craft of clothing. Decorations of the icy vein in survival. Humans could not resist beauty. Some of the earliest known ornaments, beads made from shells, animal teeth and bones, were sewn into hides, not for warmth, not for function, but for expression, perhaps to mark belonging to a group, perhaps to please the eye, perhaps simply because, even then, humans found joy in shaping the world into meaning. What began as necessity soon carried pride. A decorated hide was a quiet announcement. I am alive. I made this. I belong. The Neanderthal contribution, long before modern humans perfected clothing. Neanderthals had already mastered much of it, though often portrayed as primitive. They lived in some of the coldest climates of the Ice Age, and survived, therefore, over 200,000 years. Their shelters show evidence of hides used as insulation. Stone scrapers, awls, and pigment stains suggest they processed skins and may have colored them. While no Neanderthal clothing survives, their bones tell the story. Few frostbite marks, well-preserved joints, and signs of muscular warmth, proof that they knew how to keep the cold out. If early humans learned to clothe themselves, it was often by watching them. The lessons of warmth passed not just through generations, but across species. The invention of layers clothing evolved with experimentation. At first, one hide was enough, but with time, people realized that air, the thin space between layers, held heat better than thickness alone. Thus began the layering principle. Inner wrap for warmth, outer hide for wind. A small, invisible revolution by layering furs, feathers, and grasses. Early humans could survive temperatures that would have otherwise killed them within hours. It wasn't magic. It was observation turned into design. Adapting to every climate. As humans spread across the planet, their clothing adapted to every new challenge in colder regions. Furs became heavier and denser: reindeer, mammoth, bear. In warmer areas, hides grew thinner, cut shorter, replaced with bark fibers or woven grass. Over time, as humans reached the coasts, they began to experiment with fish skins, remarkably strong and flexible when dried. Every material told a story of place. Clothing was no longer just survival, it was geography worn on the body. The invisible revolution unlike the invention of fire or tools. The invention of clothing left few traces behind. Leather decays. Fiber rots, but its impact is everywhere. It allowed humans to live where no other primate could, to cross ice fields, climb mountains, and traverse deserts without clothing. There would have been no migration, no exploration, no map of the world. It was the quiet revolution that wrapped humanity in the confidence to go further. The earliest explorers did not carry flags or symbols. They carried fur against frost, leather against wind, sinew, thread, and bone needles, the tools of warmth and will. The meaning of warmth clothing was more than a shield. It changed how humans felt about themselves. Covered, they became separate from nature, no longer naked creatures, but makers, creators, shapers of their own protection. It introduced modesty, identity, and even imagination. When you wrap yourself, you begin to conceal, and from concealment comes mystery, individuality, self, in a very real sense. Clothing was the beginning of culture, the first symbolic layer between human and world. The invention of clothing was quiet, gradual, and profoundly human. It was not invented in a moment, but across generations, stitched together by hands that sought warmth and found identity in the flickering firelight. As early humans sewed hides with bone needles and sinew thread, they were not just preparing for another cold night. They were reshaping the limits of where they could live, who they could be, and what it meant to survive together. One question remains: once humans had warmth, once they could live anywhere, what would they do with that freedom? Would they wander forever, or begin to shape the world into something entirely their own? By the time the great ice sheets stretched across Europe, humans were no longer simply wearing hides. They were crafting them. What began as a desperate wrapping of warmth had evolved into one of humankind's earliest technologies, the deliberate making of clothing. If Section 1 was the story of discovery, this is the story of refinement, the slow, deliberate process through which early humans became tailors of their own survival. A firelit workshop. Imagine a cave in winter. The air outside is cold enough to freeze breath mid-sentence. Inside, smoke curls upward in slow ribbons, its scent a mixture of burnt bone, animal fat, and tanned hide. At the center of the firelight, a group of humans sits together. One sharpens a flint scraper on a stone. Another stretches a hide across her knees, smoothing it with a fragment of bone. Beside her, a younger member of the group threads a length of sinew through a hole made by a bone. They are not working quickly. Each movement is slow, careful, repetitive. The scraping, the sewing, the tug of thread, the kind of work that takes patience rather than strength. This is not the story of a great invention, but of practice repeated until it becomes skill, and across millennia. This patience would clothe an entire species. Thread and needle, the first true needles, date back nearly 40,000 years, made from bird bone, carved so precisely that a thread of animal sinew could be passed through the tiny eye bone. Ivory and antler were the earliest sewing tools. Flint or obsidian was too brittle for such delicate work, but bone could be shaped, polished, and sharpened to a fine point. Thread came from whatever the landscape offered: strips of animal tendon, twisted plant fiber, even thin strands of animal gut. To imagine early sewing is to imagine remarkable patience. Each puncture through hide required force. Each pull of thread required balance. Too tight, and the hide tore. Too loose, and the cold would slip through. It was craftsmanship born from necessity, and perhaps, as those early hands worked through the long dark of winter, the rhythm of sewing became as meditative as it was essential. Learning to fit the body, early hides were draped loosely, but over generations, humans began to notice that some cuts stayed warmer. Others allowed easier movement. In time, hides were shaped not just to cover, but to fit. The first patterns weren't drawn on parchment. They were remembered in muscle and gesture. The curve of an arm, the slope of a shoulder, the bend of a knee. From these observations, the earliest tunics, leggings, and hooded cloaks took form. A cloak cut along the shoulder allowed better reach with a spear. Leggings kept snow from biting the calves. A hood, drawn from a single piece of hide, protected the neck and ears. Each improvement was small, barely worth notice, but together they transformed clothing from a blanket into a tool of movement. For the first time, humans could not only survive the cold, they could work in it. The cold teaches it. Was the Ice Age that refined this art. When temperatures plunged across Europe and northern Asia, only those who mastered protection could thrive. Archaeological sites from Siberia, Germany, and the Czech Republic reveal sophisticated clothing construction: fur-lined parkas, layered leggings, even tailored boots. These were not crude wrappings. They were engineered garments, each designed for purpose. The hunters of the Mammoth Steppe wore fitted clothing to keep out biting wind. Their hides were scraped thin, then doubled in layers. First side inward for warmth, they tied them with twisted cords woven from sinew and grass, sometimes decorated with bone toggles or beads. In this way, necessity became ingenuity, and the cold a quiet teacher. The Neanderthal legacy lives on. By the time Homo sapiens began perfecting clothing, their cousins, the Neanderthals, were fading from the world. Yet traces of Neanderthal craftsmanship lingered in their tools, scrapers and awls used for hide preparation were found across ancient Neanderthal sites in France and Spain, suggesting that they had already mastered the early steps of clothing manufacture. Some modern anthropologists suggest that humans may have borrowed and adapted these techniques. If true, it means that our species' ability to endure the Ice Age may have been built, in part, on Neanderthal wisdom. Even as one branch of humanity vanished, another carried its lessons forward. In every stitched seam and softened hide, the hidden art of thread might seem insignificant. Yet it was one of humanity's earliest triumphs in transforming nature into technology. To make a thread strong enough to hold clothing together required both strength and subtlety. Animal sinew, the fibrous tissue running along the back or leg of an animal, was ideal. It could be stripped, pounded, twisted, and dried into long, tough strands. When moistened, it softened, easily. Once dry, it tightened, pulling seams snug. Plant fibers like flax and nettle also made excellent thread, used by groups in more temperate regions to create them. One had to soak the stalks in water, separate the fibers by hand, and twist them into long cords. It was slow, monotonous work, but it connected the human body to the earth in a profound way, turning grass into garment, plant into protection. Every strand was a link between people and the world they depended on. The clothing of movement clothing did not merely protect, it enabled before tailored clothing. Winter meant stillness, waiting out the cold in caves or shelters, but with fur-lined boots, leggings, and cloaks. Humans could move through snow, follow herds, and hunt even in bitter weather. This mobility meant more than comfort. It meant survival. Groups could migrate farther, forage longer, and establish seasonal patterns that spanned hundreds of miles. Clothing made movement possible, and movement made the world wider. From this came the first true nomads, families who could carry warmth with them wherever they went. Aesthetic, by accident, somewhere along the line. Clothing stopped being only about function. Perhaps it began when someone tied a hide with an unusual knot, or when a hunter decorated his belt with beads made from animal teeth. Maybe a mother sewed a few shells into her child's tunic, not for warmth, but as a quiet mark of care. Whatever the reason, utility became expression. The small act of sewing a bead onto a hide may have been humanity's first fashion, not in the modern sense, but as a way to say, I am not just surviving, I am living. And in that shift, the earliest threads of identity were woven. From the hunt to the hearth, active clothing making changed the rhythm of daily life. Before, the hunt defined existence, dangerous, unpredictable, dependent on strength and luck. But the work of sewing, tanning, and crafting offered something different. Routine. Women, men, and children all contributed. While some hunted, others prepared hides, sharpened awls, or gathered plants for cordage. The hearth became a workshop. It was here, during long, dark winters, that early humans found purpose beyond mere survival. They created garments that would outlast the season. They experimented with materials. They passed techniques down through generations. Clothing was no longer just a thing they had. It was something they did. And that difference marked a new kind of intelligence, one that built upon itself, patiently and deliberately, the social thread in many ways. Clothing became the first shared language. A group's garments could reveal who they were: hunters of reindeer, gatherers of roots, dwellers by the sea. The materials, cuts, and decorations carried meaning. To recognize someone's clothing was to understand their life, their landscape, their skills, their needs. Even today, our clothing silently tells the same story. What we do, where we belong, how we live. That connection stretches unbroken from the Ice Age to now, a thread running through every sleeve, and seemed on evolution in warmth by 30,000 years ago. Humans were not only surviving the cold, but thriving in it. They built shelters from mammoth bones, insulated them with hides, and lined them with fur bedding. Clothing was part of a complete environmental mastery, protection layered upon protection. The Ice Age, once an unstoppable force, had become a manageable challenge, and yet, with every improvement in warmth, came a new question. What happens when survival becomes secure? When the cold no longer dictates where we go or how we live, what does humanity do next? The edge of a new era clothing had changed everything. It allowed migrations across continents. It expanded food sources. It gave humans the courage to explore regions that would have otherwise been forbidden by frost. But it also brought something else: settlement. Because once humans learned how to stay warm anywhere, they began to stay somewhere. The first semi-permanent camps emerged, places where clothing and shelter worked together to protect against the elements. Fire, shelter, and clothing formed the triad of civilization's earliest comfort. It was here that people began to think, not just about surviving the world, but shaping it, and that shift, subtle yet profound, marked the beginning of everything that would follow. The invention of clothing was more than protection against the cold. It was the moment humans became designers of their own destiny. From bone needles to sinew thread, from scraped hide to fitted hood, every stitch was a declaration of patience and persistence. Clothing turned survival into creativity. It gave humans the power not only to endure their environment, but to transform it. But as they settled and grew comfortable, a new challenge was already forming: how to create enough for everyone. How would early humans manage the work of clothing making as groups grew larger, and the tasks of survival became more complex? By the time humanity had mastered the art of sewing, the cold was no longer a constant threat. It had become a teacher that had done its work. The Ice Age still loomed, but now humans were no longer its students. They were its survivors. And yet, once warmth was no longer in question, something unexpected began to unfold. Clothing, once a humble tool of endurance, started to shape not just how humans lived, but who they were. This is the quiet, subtle moment when fur and fiber turned into identity. When clothing began to stitch together societies, and just as easily pull them apart. The hearth becomes a workshop as human groups settled for longer stretches, sometimes months, sometimes entire seasons. The act of making clothing became central to daily life. Fires burned, not just for cooking, but for softening hides. Stones once used for weapons were now polished smooth for scraping leather. Bones that might have become spear tips were carved into needles. Each hearth became a place of industry. The scent of smoke mixed with the sharp tinge of tanned hide and the faint sweetness of animal fat. This was the hum of survival, steady and soft. Over time, tasks divided naturally. Some were better hunters, their arms strong and steady. Others, often those with patience and sharp eyes, became the tanners and the tailors. The work was tedious but vital. Without it, the group could not face the cold. In this quiet division of labor, humanity took one of its first steps toward social organization. Not kings or rulers, not yet, but roles. The rise of the skilled hand to make good clothing was not easy. It required more than muscle. It required attention. A missed stitch could let in wind. A poorly scraped hide could rot within weeks. Those who mastered the craft were prized. In some Ice Age camps, these artisans may have been as respected as hunters, their skill directly tied to the survival of all. In later archaeological finds, such as the Sunjir site in Russia, dating back nearly 30,000 years, Researchers uncovered burials containing elaborately beaded clothing, tunics, caps, leggings, each adorned with thousands of ivory beads. Such garments would have taken months, even years, to complete. They were not the work of survival. They were the work of status. Whoever wore them was not simply clothed. They were marked, the first signs that clothing could speak, not in words, but in meaning, had begun. Clothing as communication clothing began to carry quiet messages. A decorated hide might signal belonging to a group, or perhaps skill in the hunt. Shells sewn into garments could show access to trade or travel. Colored pigments, red ochre, black charcoal, yellow clay, might mark identity, memory, or ritual in every stitch. The language of status was forming, and just as quickly as it brought people together, it began to create difference. Those who could adorn their clothing stood apart from those who could not. Warmth was universal, but beauty began to have a cost. The first hierarchies were not spoken. They were worn, a new kind of warmth when a mother wrapped her child in a carefully sewn cloak, or when a hunter tied a bone clasp to his tunic. They were participating in something larger than survival. They were passing on memory. Each piece of clothing was a record of who made it, how it was worn, what it endured. Hides carried the scratches of hunts, stains of smoke, and impressions of tools. To repair a garment was to honor the work of the one who first made it in this way. Clothing became the earliest heirloom, and in the rhythm of mending and making, humans began to understand time not only as passing, but as continuing. Trade in the cold as human groups began to interact through travel, migration, or simple curiosity. Clothing became one of the first goods exchanged. Some groups had finer hides, others had better tools, some had shells, beads, or pigments that others lacked. Clothing was not just worn, it was traded, carried across valleys and along frozen rivers in the ancient site of Dolny Vestinus. Archaeologists have found impressions of woven fabrics in clay, the earliest evidence of textile work, nearly 30,000 years old. This discovery suggests something astonishing, that humans were not only making clothing, but selling or sharing techniques across long distances. And within that network lay the seeds of what would one day become economy. The weavers and the hunters' populations grew. A quiet transformation took place. Hunting and gathering remained essential, but now those who could create, repair, and decorate clothing had a new kind of influence. The skilled tanner, the careful seamstress, the weaver who knew how to twist fibers into thread. They became as necessary to life as the spearmaker or the firekeeper, and unlike the hunt, which required the strength of youth, the making of clothing valued patience and precision, skills that could last a lifetime. Elders, who could no longer chase game, could still teach how to sew, how to tan, how to shape a hide to fit the human form. The knowledge did not leave with age. It deepened clothing in a way, gave wisdom a physical shape. The sound of thread in every camp, there would have been the same sounds, the scraping of hide, the steady thud of bone on stone, the pull and tug of sinew thread. These sounds, repeated endlessly, became the background rhythm of human life. Some anthropologists believe that this rhythm, repetitive, steady, soothing, may have shaped early song. Perhaps the first lullabies were hummed by those sewing by the fire, keeping hands busy while minds drifted with memory. The connection between making and music, between craft and comfort, may be older than language itself. Adornment and the idea of self. Once humans began to decorate clothing, they began to decorate themselves. The act of piercing a shell or polishing a bead carried the same impulse that would one day carve statues and paint walls in the caves of France, Spain, and North Africa. Beads, pendants, and fragments of colored stone have been found alongside sewing tools. It's easy to imagine that a single act, sewing a bead into a hide, became something deeply human. The desire to be seen, even in a harsh and colorless landscape. People sought ways to make themselves visible. The act of dressing became, for the first time, the act of becoming. The power of the maker over generations. The skills of hide working, thread making, and sewing evolved into specialized crafts in time. These crafts shaped the roles of men and women, elders and youth. Anthropologists note that across early societies, the division of clothing labor often mirrored the rhythms of life itself. Those who stayed near the hearth created, those who traveled hunted, but the balance was delicate. Without the makers, the hunters could not survive. Without the hunters, the makers had nothing to work with. This interdependence wove humans together more tightly than any seam. Each role existed for the other, a living thread running through the group. And when that balance held, people thrived. The transformation of identity. By the time humanity began its slow path out of the Ice Age, clothing had become inseparable from culture. What people wore now reflected not just where they lived, but how they thought. Nomads of the tundra wore fur-lined leggings and hooded cloaks. Those near rivers began to weave reeds and bark fibers into softer garments. Highland dwellers wrapped themselves in thick layers, each hide stitched with the pattern of their community. Clothing became a reflection of place, the landscape made wearable. And in this reflection, humans began to see difference not just between us and them, but between the many ways of being human. Clothing was the first mirror in which humanity saw itself. The seeds of the future, from the hides of mammoths to the fibers of plants. The techniques born in the Ice Age would one day evolve into spinning, weaving, dyeing, and fashion. The thread that once held together a fur cloak would, thousands of years later, hold together empires. The same urge to decorate a hide would become embroidery, tapestry, silk. And the same hands that stitched for warmth would one day stitch for beauty alone. Yet even in modern times, every hem, every collar, every thread carries a trace of that first purpose. The primal desire to protect the fragile warmth within, the meaning beneath the fabric. It's easy to see clothing as something simple, fabric, fashion, utility. But beneath that lies a much older story, a story of pain, patience, and adaptation. It tells us that survival was never just about strength or speed, but about craft, that the quietest work done in the dim light of a cave, by hands weathered and steady, could change the course of the species. Clothing made us human in more ways than one. It shielded us from nature, yes, but also from fear. It gave us comfort, and with comfort, time to think, dream, and plan. The first seam may well have been the first moment we separated ourselves from the wild and began to build the long fabric of civilization. End of story. Reflection. Invention of clothing began with cold and ended with community. What started as mere protection grew into art, memory, and meaning through fur and fiber. Early humans learned not just how to survive, but how to belong. From a draped hide to a tailored cloak, every stitch told a story of family, of work, of identity. And even now, thousands of years later, when we fasten a button or tie a thread, we are echoing the same ancient gesture, the quiet act of keeping the world out and our humanity in. Still, one question lingers. When we first wrapped ourselves against the cold, did we begin to warm only our bodies, or also, for the first time, our sense of who we were? In the long, dark stretches of prehistory, night, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the landscape vanished into shadow. The cold pressed against exposed skin. Predators prowled silently in the dark. Without light, humans were at the mercy of their senses, limited and vulnerable. And yet, somewhere along the edge of the wild, humans discovered fire, not as a flickering danger, but as a companion. This section begins with the first sparks of the campfire, humble, often accidental, yet transformative. The discovery of fire changed life, thought, and the very structure of society. It was the quiet revolution that brought humans together and created the conditions for storytelling, planning, and culture itself. The discovery of fire was probably first encountered in nature. Lightning strikes, igniting dry grass, volcanic activity sparking flames in forests, or even spontaneous combustion in peat bogs. Early humans, cautious and curious, would have observed these natural flames from a distance. Some may have approached, throwing branches into the fire to see the effect. Others may have noticed that cooked meat from burned carcasses tasted better or was easier to chew. Over time, humans learned to preserve fire, carrying embers from one shelter to another, sheltering sparks under moss or fat-soaked bark. This was a revolutionary step. Fire became portable, allowing humans to carry warmth, light, and protection with them. Fire as protection before fire. Night was a predator's hour. Wolves, big cats, and other carnivores moved freely, hunting by stealth. The first humans who sat around a fire at dusk learned something fundamental. The light kept predators away. It is easy to imagine the relief, almost the wonder, as shadows retreated from the circle of light. A fire didn't just burn wood, it burned fear itself, giving humans a measure of safety that was almost magical. Even today, sitting beside a fire evokes the same sense of security. That deep human instinct, the calm amidst danger, originated in those first moments by a spark in the dark. The fire, still early, campfires were simple, a cleared patch of earth, stones around the edge, and a stack of branches or reeds. But from this simplicity emerged something profound. The fire circle. Humans naturally gathered around warmth and light. Around that fire, the tribe or family group became more than a collection of individuals. It became a unit, a community. Conversations, low, repetitive, and soothing, filled the space. People shared observations, instructions, and soon, stories. Even in the absence of writing, humans could record events in memory, passing lessons from one generation to the next. The campfire became the first classroom, the first council, and the first theater, cooking and nutrition. The fire also changed what humans could eat. Raw meat was replaced with roasted meat, fish, and tubers. Some foods became safer as the heat killed parasites and bacteria. Others, like roots and tough grains, were transformed into something digestible. Cooking also increased caloric intake. Food that was once difficult to chew became easy, freeing energy for the body and the brain. Anthropologists suggest that this extra energy fueled larger brains and more complex thought in this sense. Fire did not just change survival, it changed intelligence, and yet it was slow, methodical work. Tending the fire, gathering fuel, and maintaining embers required attention and cooperation. These mundane, often overlooked tasks shaped the social rhythms of early humans as much as hunting or gathering. Social bonds and storytelling. The fire circle created an ideal environment for social interaction. Children sat wide-eyed as elders recounted hunts, migrations, and seasons past. Lessons about edible plants, animal behavior, or weather patterns were shared in story form, often dramatized to make the lesson memorable. These early narratives were not entertainment as we think of it today. They were essential survival tools, encoded in memory through repetition, rhythm, and detail. In the firelight, humans began to practice the earliest forms of language. Gestures, sounds, and eventually words were refined as storytelling became central to survival. The first campfire stories were quiet yet profound, tales of danger and strategy, of past successes and failures, of human ingenuity. Fire and the long night remained long and dangerous, but the fire allowed humans to endure it. Imagine sitting by a crackling flame while snow drifts silently beyond the cave entrance. The smell of burning wood fills your nose. Your limbs are warm. You can watch the glow flicker on the walls. In that glow, humans began to notice things previously invisible: the shapes of leaves, the curve of rocks, the stars above. Fire extended vision. It extended life. And it extended imagination. The darkness outside became less of a limit and more of a canvas, waiting for human thought, planning, and the fire. The fire also allowed for the first long-term planning. Humans could roast and preserve meat for later meals. They could soften hides for clothing, boil water to purify it, and prepare tools for the next day's hunt. Tasks were divided and scheduled, giving structure to the day beyond mere survival. Even the rhythm of sleep was influenced by the fire. Humans could rest in safety, knowing the warmth and light would last through the night. Fire became the center of life, both practical and symbolic. A tool for planning, a teacher of cooperation, and a source of comfort. The spread of fire knowledge over time. The knowledge of fire-making spread. Techniques such as striking flint against pyrite or rubbing sticks together to generate friction became refined. Groups shared knowledge along migration routes, creating networks of understanding across continents. This was not just survival technology, it was cultural technology. The fire carried with it lessons in patience, observation, and experimentation. Each ember preserved not just heat but knowledge, and through fire, Humans could influence landscapes, clearing forests, managing grasslands, and eventually shaping environments to suit their needs. Symbolism and ritual fire quickly acquired symbolic meaning. It represented life, warmth, and community. In some cultures, it became sacred, an eternal flame, a ritual object, a mediator between humans and nature. Even before formal religion, the fire was revered. To control fire was to control a fundamental aspect of existence. The circle around the flame became a space for reflection, teaching, and ceremony. It was here that humans first began to ask questions larger than survival. Why are we here? What does it mean to endure? The campfire, as memory fires, preserved memory. Not only did humans share lessons and stories, but they also recorded experiences. Scorched stones and ashes marked locations. Charred bones told what was eaten and when. Burned pits indicated shelter and habit. Some of the oldest archaeological sites, like Gesher, Banat, Yaakov in Israel, contain evidence of fire use dating back nearly 800,000 years. These sites show repeated burning, suggesting humans returned to the same places to kindle fire again and again. Fire created a continuity of experience. It allowed humans to carry knowledge across generations and to learn from repeated practice. A world transformed once humans mastered fire. The world changed subtly but irrevocably. They could survive harsher climates, venture further from equatorial regions, and endure winters that would have otherwise been fatal. Fire allowed people to manipulate the environment. They could cook, light dark spaces, drive away predators, and even use smoke to communicate or preserve food. Perhaps most importantly, fire enabled humans to gather and talk. No other species had yet done so, sitting in groups around a controlled flame, discussing, reflecting, imagining. The campfire was humanity's first shared laboratory of thought. The fire circle and human thought psychologists and anthropologists suggest that fire may have been instrumental in the development of higher reasoning. The quiet observation, storytelling, and problem-solving around the flame trained the mind to plan ahead, to consider consequences, and to imagine scenarios beyond immediate perception. In essence, fire may have been the first teacher of human foresight. Those who sat by the fire learned not only to survive, but to anticipate, and anticipation, the ability to project oneself beyond the present, would prove essential to civilization. End of section. Reflection. The campfire was more than warmth and light. It was a gathering point for thought, social cohesion, and human creativity. Every spark was a lesson. Every ember preserved knowledge. Every circle of firelight brought humans together, teaching them the rhythm of cooperation, planning, and storytelling through fire. Early humans learned not only how to endure the dark, but also how to think in it, how to imagine, remember, and share. Yet the question remains, as fire became a central part of life, how did it change the way humans understood themselves and their place in the world? When humans first sat around fire, the world outside the circle remained vast, cold, and unknowable. But inside the glow, time seemed to slow. The fire created not only warmth and safety, but also a space for reflection, cooperation, and imagination. This section explores how the simple act of gathering around a campfire transformed human society, cognition, and culture. It was here in the flickering light that humans learned not only to survive, but to think together. Fire as a social magnet. Fire created a natural center for group activity. Unlike other species that may rest in solitary burrows or dens, humans were drawn toward the warmth and light. The fire circle encouraged face-to-face interaction. People could observe gestures, expressions, and subtle cues in others' behavior. Communication became richer, more complex, and more nuanced. Even the silence of a shared fire carried meaning, awareness, attentiveness, and the comfort of community. The quiet became a tool for social cohesion. In this way, fire did not merely illuminate objects. It illuminated relationships. Learning and teaching fire created a structured environment for knowledge transfer. Elders could demonstrate tool-making techniques without the constraints of daylight. Hunters could describe tracking strategies, routes, and seasonal patterns. Women and children could learn about gathering, preparing hides, and cooking. Storytelling became a primary method of instruction. These narratives often included detailed observation of the environment, the migration of herds, the habits of predators, the ripening cycles of plants. Because storytelling at the fire was repetitive and socially reinforced, memory improved. Lessons that might have been forgotten in the chaos of hunting or traveling could now be preserved for future generations. Fire was both a teacher and a repository of collective wisdom. The cognitive revolution anthropologists often point to fire as a catalyst for the development of higher cognitive functions. The control of fire required foresight to gather fuel, maintain embers, and anticipate changes in wind or weather. It demanded cooperation. Individuals had to share responsibilities for tending the flame. And it demanded imagination to transform the abstract dangers of the night into manageable routines, to invent stories, and to reflect on human experience. In other words, fire helped shape the human brain. It was not simply a tool of survival. It was a cognitive amplifier. The evening ritual, even in early human groups, patterns emerged around the fire. As darkness fell, the work of the day ended. Children were fed and cared for. Adults rested from hunting or gathering, and everyone gathered around the flame. This ritualized time created a sense of rhythm and stability. People could anticipate the transition from day to night, from activity to reflection. The fire circle became a stage for memory, imagination, and planning. People could rehearse hunting strategies, retell past successes, or imagine new ideas. These nightly rituals were, in essence, early forms of community governance, education, and cultural continuity. The development of language fire may have accelerated the evolution of language. The controlled environment allowed humans to experiment with speech in a safe context. Quiet, repetitive, and attentive listening enabled the refinement of sounds, gestures, and eventually words. Some anthropologists suggest that the rhythm of fire crackling flames, popping embers, influenced the rhythm of early speech and song. Storytelling by fire was both auditory and visual. Gestures and mimicry became part of the narrative. Over thousands of years, these small social experiments laid the foundation for complex language. Cooking as a cognitive tool, cooking by fire did more than improve nutrition. It changed thought patterns. Roasting meat and roots requires timing, attention, and problem solving. Humans learned to predict when food would be ready. how to adjust heat, and which materials made the best fuel. These practices developed foresight, planning, and trial-and-error learning, all critical cognitive skills. In effect, fire taught humans to think in steps. The same foresight applied to hunting, shelter building, and social interaction. Cooking around a fire was as much a mental exercise as a practical one. Fire as a memory keeper. The placement and maintenance of fires also served as a form of record keeping. Repeatedly used hearths indicated the presence of a group in a particular location. Burn patterns and discarded ash gave clues about diet, season, and lifestyle. For early humans, fire left both tangible and intangible marks. It preserved knowledge, recorded activity, and marked the boundaries of human habitation. The fire became a historical tool chronicling human adaptation to different landscapes. Cooperation and conflict. Tending a fire required trust and cooperation. Fuel gathering and flame maintenance were collective responsibilities. At the same time, fire created opportunities for subtle social negotiation. Who controlled the central hearth had influence. Access to warmth and light was power. Decisions about fuel, rotation, and placement involved negotiation and compromise. In this way, fire indirectly shaped early social hierarchies and the emergence of leadership roles. It is remarkable to consider that many social structures, roles, respect, and authority may have roots in the management of a flickering flame. Fire and creativity beyond survival. Fire encouraged creativity. Humans began experimenting with smoke, sparks, and flame behavior. They observed patterns in the movement of light and shadow, sometimes using them to entertain, warn, or teach. Shadows on cave walls, cast by flickering flames, may have inspired some of the first symbolic or representational art. While this remains speculative, the connection between firelight, observation, and imagination is compelling. Fire offered a medium for experimentation, a way to visualize abstract concepts in a controlled environment. Social bonding through fire. Fire strengthened bonds in ways that were subtle yet profound. Sitting together around a fire fostered empathy and cooperation. People shared warmth and food, narrated experiences, and communicated emotional states. Anthropologists suggest that the fire circle may have been critical in forming long-term social cohesion. Humans could plan collectively, distribute resources, and resolve conflicts in a shared, illuminated space. Fire created trust, a rare commodity in the wilderness of prehistory. Migration and fire. As humans migrated across continents, fire became a mobile technology. Groups carried embers or learned fire-making techniques, allowing them to survive in new, harsher climates. From tropical forests to icy plains, fire became the constant companion of migration. Fire allowed humans to push boundaries, explore unfamiliar territories, and survive where other species could not. It was both a tool and a partner in the human expansion across the globe. Without fire, many landscapes would have remained uninhabitable. The first stories emerged. These stories were practical: how to find food, avoid predators, or interpret the weather. But they were also imaginative legends of animals, spirits, or natural phenomena that humans could not yet explain. Storytelling transmitted cultural knowledge, social norms, and moral lessons. It was early education, entertainment, and communal reflection all in one. Stories reinforced identity, who belonged to the group, who had knowledge, and who could be trusted. Fire was the silent witness to the creation of culture. End of section. Reflection. The campfire was far more than a tool. It was a center of society, a teacher, a record keeper, and a stage for imagination. Through fire, early humans learned cooperation, foresight, language, and storytelling. They could endure the night, expand into new territories, and preserve knowledge for generations. Yet, the question remains, as fire became central to human life, what new forms of culture and organization would emerge? How would the control and use of fire influence not just survival, but the structure of human communities themselves? By the time humans had mastered fire, the small spark that once offered warmth and light had become a cornerstone of civilization. The campfire, modest and flickering, had transformed human society in subtle yet profound ways. It was no longer just survival. It was the shaping of identity, culture, and cognition. This final section explores how the control and communal use of fire laid the groundwork for social structures, early technology, and the shared imagination that would define humanity. Fire, as a center of society, fire became the unifying force of the group. Early humans organized themselves around the hearth. The placement of the fire, the tending of the flame, and the distribution of warmth required cooperation. These tasks established early social norms and responsibilities. Those who maintained the fire, often women, elders, or skilled artisans, gained influence. They controlled a resource central to survival. This was not a power enforced by violence, but by necessity and respect. In effect, the fire was an early institution, a shared resource around which social rules, hierarchies, and cooperation were organized. Division of labor around the flame. The campfire naturally created a division of labor. Hunters brought food to the fire. Others cooked, prepared hides, or maintained tools. Children observed, learned, and practiced under adult supervision. Elders shared knowledge of seasons, animal behavior, and migration patterns. This division of labor was practical, but it also had cognitive and social consequences. Humans learned to rely on each other's skills, fostering trust and interdependence. The campfire was a microcosm of society, small, self-contained, yet reflecting larger principles of cooperation and organization that would eventually scale to villages and cities. Fire and the growth of language. Fire accelerated the development of language. Around the hearth, humans could speak without distraction, interpret subtle gestures, and observe reactions. Repetition and storytelling reinforced memory, expanding vocabulary and narrative skills. Stories told by fire were the first educational tools. They communicated survival strategies, moral codes, and cultural identity. Over generations, these narratives shaped not only knowledge, but also cognition itself. The fire circle became the crucible in which complex language and thought were forged. Planning, memory, and long-term thinking. With fire, humans could store energy and extend their activities into the night. They could cook food, preserve embers, and plan for the next day. The hearth allowed for the rehearsal of hunting strategies, the preparation of clothing, and even the development of rudimentary calendars based on seasonal patterns. Fire taught humans to think beyond the immediate moment. It demanded foresight, patience, and attention to detail. The daily rhythms around the fire laid the foundation for structured thinking, long-term planning, and the anticipation of consequences, cognitive skills, essential for survival and innovation. The birth of cultural identifier also shaped culture around the hearth. Humans established rituals, cleaning, preparation, cooking, storytelling, and communal reflection. These rituals created continuity, linking one generation to the next. Clothing, tools, and fire management techniques were passed down, often with subtle variations. Groups began to develop distinctive cultural identities, recognizable to others by their methods, behaviors, and stories. Even simple practices, like the way fire was maintained or embers shared, became markers of identity and belonging. Fire and conflict resolution, managing a shared resource, naturally led to negotiation. Who would tend the fire? Who would decide which food to roast first? How would limited fuel be allocated? These questions required discussion, compromise, and sometimes arbitration. Fire introduced the first arenas for conflict resolution in human society. Over time, these small negotiations became habits, shaping early social norms, cooperation strategies, and leadership structures. The campfire was, therefore, a training ground for diplomacy and human interaction. Fire as a tool of expansion. Once humans mastered fire, they could inhabit landscapes previously inhospitable in northern climates. Fire allowed the occupation of colder regions by providing warmth and enabling cooking. In dense forests or arid zones, it offered protection from predators and insects. Portable fire, carried in embers or created through friction, allowed humans to migrate with confidence. Fire was not just survival, it was expansion. It enabled humans to become a global species, moving from Africa into Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas. Fire and technology. The control of fire also catalyzed technological innovation. Heat allowed for hardening wooden tools, softening hides for clothing, and experimenting with early pigments and adhesives. Smoke and ash were used to preserve materials, deter insects, and manage landscapes. Even small, controlled experiments with fire trained humans in observation, hypothesis, and iterative problem solving, the core skills of technological thinking. Fire was the first laboratory. The flame was both teacher and tool, encouraging careful observation and creative experimentation. The first symbols and art shadows, cast by flickering flames, may have inspired the earliest human art. Animals, hunters, and abstract patterns appeared on cave walls, illuminated only by firelight. The interplay of light and shadow invited imagination, narrative, and symbolic thinking. Fire offered humans a canvas for the first symbols, a space where memory, ritual, and identity converged. Art, storytelling, and shared symbolism all emerged from the simple act of sitting together in the glow of a controlled flame. The social glue of all fire created bonds. The warmth it provided was physical, but the shared experience was emotional. Humans learned empathy, cooperation, and trust in the glow of the campfire. Families and groups that maintained fire thrived. Those that failed often did not. Fire selected not just for survival skills, but for social cohesion. In this way, fire shaped human evolution as much as predation or climate. It demanded community, patience, and cooperation, qualities that became central to our species. Fire and memory fires preserve memory, both tangible and intangible. Ash layers and hearths tell archaeologists where humans lived, what they ate, and how they organized their camps. Stories told by fire became collective memory, embedding survival strategies and cultural identity in each generation through fire. Humans learned continuity, that the present could shape the future, that knowledge could outlast an individual, and that experiences could be passed down intentionally. The campfire was humanity's first historian, the hearth of civilization by the end of the Ice Age. Fire had become central to human civilization. It shaped social structures, divided labor, and reinforced cooperation. It enabled migration, experimentation, and technology. It allowed humans to endure night, cold, and danger while fostering creativity, imagination, and narrative. Fire turned survival into culture. It transformed humans from mere hunters into storytellers, planners, and thinkers. The campfire, modest as it was, laid the foundation for villages, cities, and eventually states. It nurtured the cognitive and social abilities that would define humanity. Reflection: the campfire illustrates that civilization often grows from small, quiet acts rather than grand, dramatic events. A spark, nurtured patiently, became light in darkness. A circle of warmth became a classroom, a council, and a canvas through fire. Humans learned to cooperate, plan, imagine, and communicate. They created culture, shared identity, and a sense of belonging. And yet, one question lingers. As humans expanded control over fire, how would they begin to extend control over the wider world? From the humble hearth, the next challenges awaited, shaping landscapes, managing resources, and eventually shaping human destiny itself. The first tools were simple, yet their impact was profound. Each chipped stone, each sharpened edge, extended the reach of human hands and imagination. Through patience and repetition, early humans learned more than survival. They learned foresight, cooperation, and creativity. These quiet, unassuming objects remind us that history is often shaped not by grand events, but by small, deliberate acts. The stones that once cut meat, scraped hides, and split wood were the earliest machines, and in their careful use, humanity discovered the power of ingenuity. As we leave these early hands behind, we carry forward their lessons, that even the simplest tools, when wielded with thought, can shape the course of history.